And Louise and I have been doing this sort of stuff since 2009. And you'll notice, what does the sign say? It says, educate, elevate, and advocate. So that's our new slogan. We just got back from Washington, D.C. in the presence of these fine folks at the Churches for Middle East Peace Conference. And so the main purpose of the evening is to educate and then talk about it when you leave. And then become an advocate. So we'll talk about that when our speakers are done today. So thank you for being here. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Israel or Palestine. Okay, thank you. Have you ever lived in Israel or Palestine? Yes, a couple. Very good. I would like to introduce, representing our host on behalf of Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP, Molly, who will take over, and she will be our moderator tonight. She'll introduce you to our two guests. Before we start, I want to thank Laurel, our associate rector, pastor, for supporting the effort, being here tonight. And I'd like to honor Lois Katz, who we have seen in the Capitol at the CMEP conferences at the prayer breakfasts. And she's been a featured speaker at the prayer breakfasts. So thank you for being here, guys. And Molly, take it over.
Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm not going to hold the mic then. So my name is Molly Lorden. I have been working with CMEP for about a year and a half. This is actually kind of my last hurrah with CMEP. I'm so honored to be here and be with these wonderful women. I was doing our Millennial Engagement for Churches from Middle East Peace. CMEP is Churches from Middle East Peace, just so you're aware who we are. And I just finished seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary, got my MDiv, and then got back home in San Diego, so not too far from here, working with the United Methodist Church. But we're just coming off of our annual Advocacy Summit in Washington, D.C. The theme this year was And Still We Rise, based on the Maya Angelou poem, and the goal is really to highlight women peacemakers in the Middle East. Most of our work is on Israel-Palestine, about 80%, and then 20% is on the broader Middle East. And as Art said, our kind of primary areas are to advocate, so to shift U.S. policy towards a more holistic view of peace and justice, to elevate, which is elevating voices from the region, which is what's going on with this summit. We brought in about 15 women from the Middle East to come speak and be part of the summit, and then to go on these pilgrimage to peace tours. That's what we call this part of our work. And then to educate. So these pilgrimage to peace tours bring voices to churches around the country. From the summit, we have groups going to Minnesota, Florida, New York, and Denver. And I think that's it. And some stayed in Washington, D.C. to do some work as well. So we're so excited to be here. These women that I'm with are absolutely incredible. And I'm sure you'll learn a lot from them, and you'll hear a little more about CMEP as the night goes on. And we're just honored. So with that, I would like to introduce Lisa Loden, who I didn't ask you this before. What do you see first? Yeah, okay. So Lisa Loden is a Messianic Jew who has lived in Israel since 1974. She co-founded Messianic congregation Beit Asaph in Netanya, Israel. She served on the faculty of the Nazareth Evangelical Theological Seminary from 2008 to 2012 and created their Leadership Development Program. Lisa is engaged in several international ecumenical theological dialogues. She is co-chair of the Lausanne Initiative for Reconciliation in Israel-Palestine and is member of Musalaha Reconciliation Ministries Advisory Board. With Salim Munayer, she co-authored Through My Enemy's Eyes, Envisioning Reconciliation in Israel-Palestine. She is a founding member and co-leader of In His Image, Women for Change, and has written for Another Voice. I also have with us Janine Rashmali, who is a public affairs officer at the PLO General Delegation for the United States, where she leads the delegation's programs with civil society organizations, NGOs, policy institutions, and think tanks. Prior to joining the PLO General Delegation in Washington, D.C., Ms. Rashwami led human rights advocacy initiatives with the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies in Switzerland, Tunisia, and Washington, D.C. Her experience includes leading programs for the protection of human rights in the Arab world with the United Nations, U.S. government, and various international human rights mechanisms. She has extended experience with Palestinian human rights advocacy, research, and analysis. Jean holds a BA in Socio-Cultural Anthropology from Sonoma State University and an MA in Ethnic Studies from San Francisco State University of California. Jean conducted her graduate research on a comparative analysis of socio-political trends in Palestine, and she is currently on the board of the Network of Arab American Professionals, Washington, D.C. chapter. And so I've asked each of them to open up with a little kind of background about who they are, what they're doing, but then we really want it to be a dialogue. So as they're speaking, think of some questions. I will moderate, so questions please, not really comments, but we look forward to just having a really great conversation with all of you this evening. So, yeah.
I think I'll stand up and use this because I do have a rather soft voice. First of all, I just want to thank you for coming tonight, for being here, for being interested, for being a people who care about the situation that's far from you, really, on one level, but probably in your face almost every day as you open your newspapers, listen to your radio, watch your television, because the situation in Israel-Palestine has captured the attention of the world now for 70 years, yeah? And it seems to be continuing. So thank you for coming. It's really my privilege to be here together with you tonight. You've heard a little bit about me, but I think first of all I want to identify myself as your sister. And that is what binds us together. Every person on the face of this earth is created in the image of God and is therefore of infinite value to Him, regardless of ethnicity, of gender, geography, theology. None of these things are important because as in terms of being members of the human race, we are together united at the root. So I guess that I would say that's my primary identity on one level. I'm a woman, and being a woman in this time is not always an easy role, but it never has been. Our history of oppression and misogyny goes back a long way. But today, being a woman, being able to stand here before you, we are all equal before God. I said my primary identity is that I'm part of the human race, but my identity as a follower of Jesus seems to me to be the most important identity for me as an individual. Ethnically, I'm Jewish. I'm an Israeli citizen. I hold dual citizenship in Israel and in the United States. I was born in this country, but I immigrated with my husband to Israel in 1974, so that's a long time ago. And I've seen many, many changes since I've been in that country. And I have to say that most of those changes are following a downward trajectory. As an Israeli citizen, it is my responsibility to stand for justice, for righteousness, for peace, and for truth in my nation. And what that means is that today I stand as an advocate for these things and for the Palestinian people in the land of Israel today. It is not an easy situation to live in this country, but you know that well because you're also living through very dark times in your country today. And there are many parallels. Our leaders seem to have a lot in common. So living in this land, from the very beginning, when I first arrived in the country, I immediately saw the disparity, the difference in terms of how people lived. The Jewish population lives in a place of priority and preference. We are a Jewish democracy, and that means if push comes to shove, what's first? This has led over the years, and I would have to say today we are a racist society. absolutely. I am hesitant to use the word apartheid, although I know many do use that word. But if we continue the way we are going, I will be able to use that word. It's still, to me, a word that's a bit too strong. However, we're seeing increasing legislation that is very worrisome and is leading in this direction. And on the ground, we already see things happening that are deeply disturbing. For me, as an Israeli citizen, having lived this time in the country, founding a congregation, seeing people come to faith and serve Jesus, to walk in a way of faith, and yet be at odds with a whole community that maybe even shares the same faith, because there are many Palestinian Christians living in Israel and also living in the Palestinian territories. So we are meant to be one, but the forces of this world would pull us apart. So I immediately saw the discrepancy, the priority given to my people as opposed to the other people who were indigenous to this land. And this disturbed me from an early time. So I've been walking this journey for a very long time, for almost 45 years. And all I can say is that as I continue on this journey and I watch the trajectory in our country, I watch the increasing marginalization of anyone who dissents in our country, it creates a great tension within me. And my faith gives me the courage, the motivation to continue. And I have hope in spite of what I see as great darkness covering the earth. And my hope is in individuals, and I believe that peacemaking efforts must begin in two areas. They need to begin on the ground, grassroots level, people to people. But at the same time, they must also begin with those who have positions of authority, of influence. And we're about advocacy. We can advocate for one another. I can advocate for my Palestinian brothers and sisters, for their rights, because given the fact that we are all human and we are all of infinite value, we should have the same civil rights and the same human rights. But living in Israel-Palestine today, that is certainly not the case. And we're seeing an occupation of a people now for 70 years. We're seeing increasing desperation, and we're seeing Israel becoming a more and more militaristic society. Both peoples at this time are traumatized. There's tremendous pressure on Christians around the world, and in fact, all over the world, whether you're Christian or not, to take sides, to be pro-Israel or to be pro-Palestine. And tonight I want to challenge you not to be pro-Israel and anti-something else. I want you to open your hearts to the peoples of the land, because we are all suffering. It's a mistake to compare our sufferings. We can always say, my suffering is greater than yours. And I do have to say that the Palestinian people live under pressures that I can only imagine. And their lives are incredibly difficult as they are confined, as their freedom of movement is limited, as access to goods, services, actually entry and exit from the Palestinian territories are all controlled by Israel. And this is an occupation that must come to an end. It's detrimental, it's damaging, it's dehumanizing for both peoples. These are not Jewish values and ethics. And the soul of the Jewish people is at great risk right now in Israel. The lives of the Palestinians are at great risk. So I want to encourage you tonight to look at the picture from a broad perspective and not to take sides, but to open your hearts. I hope you will all come and visit in the land of Israel and Palestine, and that you will open your hearts and your ears to hear the stories of people. Our narratives conflict on many levels. Our aspirations for the future are also in conflict. And so we endeavor to influence wherever we can at a grassroots level and also at a higher level, the levels of government. You are gathered together here in a church, so I would assume that you are people of faith. we have another advocate. And to this advocate, we can pray for the situation. And prayer is an important part of at least who I am and many of the people that I represent here. I can speak on behalf of my Palestinian brothers and sisters because I know them very much, very deeply for many, many years. I've given my life to bring people together, to break down barriers, to create a multi-narrative situation, to really deeply understand and not just empathize, but to truly deeply understand and feel the realities in which both peoples are living. We are seeing children, our soldiers, our young men. Our society is militarized. Our children are taken at the age of, it's actually the last year in high school, second to last year, they're taken to military camps for a week to get them ready to go into the military. And so service is obligatory for young men 3 years and young women 2 years. I'm sorry to say that the believing community, the community of Jews who believe in Jesus like me, this community is also very militaristic. They send their children into the military to serve in elite units, to excel, to do the very best. And so we have many young men and women serving in intelligence units, in combat units, because of an ideology, because of a theology which you would classify as Christian Zionist, and this is also tremendously damaging to the soul of our people and to the soul of the one who's committed to a faith, a living faith.